Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the Social Media Lab Computational Social Science Bootcamp. Today's session is on how to conduct a toxicity analysis with Computational. I'm Philip Mai. I'm the co-director of the Social Media Lab. I'm here with Dr. Anatoly Gruz, our Director of Research and Canada Research Chair in Privacy Preserving Digital Technology. We're your instructor for today. I just want to let you know that we're recording the formal part of the presentation today, but we'll turn off the recording during the Q&A, so this way you're more comfortable asking questions. Feel free. And before we start, I have some quick housekeeping announcement. The video slides from session 1 is now available online at Computational.com. Just click on that red CSS Bootcamp button and you can find the videos and the slide there. Also, our next session is in 2 weeks. If you need to leave early, no worries. You can watch the video from today's session later this weekend, probably on the website. Also, this past week, we created a new community discussion group on Google. When you have a chance, please join today. You'll find the link in the chat. Anatoly will post it in a second. This will be our new online home where you can ask questions to us and from fellow users. And the other housekeeping announcement is that we are still looking for postdoc researchers to study misinformation, disinformation at scale. You must have expertise in applying and evaluating various computational approaches to large-scale networks. The ideal candidate is somebody with a doctorate in computational social science, digital sociology, communication, information system, and so on. You can find more information on our lab's website. So for today's presentation, there's 4 parts. I'll be presenting the first 2. The first part is more about the tool itself, because I know that some of you are joining us for the first time today. Some of you were here last week, but I'll provide some additional clarification as to what this tool is all about and what it can do. And then I'll quickly touch base on the type of antisocial behavior research that you can do with social media data. And then the last 3 sections are basically case studies of different ways to study antisocial behavior with social media data. I'll go over the manual content analysis, a case study that we did earlier. And then Anatoly will touch on the automated dictionary-based content analysis, and of course, the machine learning-based content analysis that you can do with Computational. Okay, so Computational is a research tool for studying online communities and online discourse. It can collect, extract, and analyze, visualize public data from various social media platforms. We designed it so that it can be used by researchers from a wide variety of disciplines. For example, some researchers simply just want to collect the data because the type of analysis that we made available is not something they would use in their field. So they just want the data and they take it and then they use it with some third-party software. Other researchers want the whole package. So basically we put together something, a whole platform where you can collect the data here, you can stay within this environment and analyze the data, visualize it in the form of networks and so on. So there are 2 versions of Computational. That wasn't made totally clear in the first presentation. There's the EDU version and the Pro version. They both have the same feature set. The main difference between the 2 is the type and the amount of data that you can get with the 2 versions. So the free version is designed for students and it's ideal for teaching and learning about social media analytics. The Pro version is for academic researchers and is ideal for large-scale academic research projects. As you can see, the account caps are quite different and significantly different, actually. For the EDU, you can only have 30,000 records shared across 3 data sets. And with the Pro, you can get up to 10 million records shared across 50 data sets. So what that means in practice is that, for example, you can have 1 data set with 10 million records in them. And if you want to capture more data set, you have to download that data set. And then you have more room in your account cap. Or you can have up to 50 data set with various amount of records in them, as long as they don't go over 10 million. And with Computational, you can get data from Reddit, from Twitter threads, and with the Pro, you can also get data from Twitter Academic Track. but you'll have to apply to Twitter for access to that. But once you have access, you can use Community to then get your data. You won't have to set up your own computer or server to always have to be on to collect the data, because we'll do it from our server. So this way you can just set it and forget it. Some of the other features for Community, along with collecting the data, is that it will provide you with the ability to do some preliminary exploratory data analysis. Will provide you with an emoji cloud, a word cloud, time series, and top poster and stuff like that. So those are things that are done automatically right off the bat when the data collection is completed. The other thing that you can do is text analysis, specifically toxicity analysis based on machine learning. And Anatoly will go over that section in more detail when it's his turn to present. And in some of the later session, we're going to be going over how to also conduct social network analysis and how to create reply network with toxicity score, and also two-mode semantic network for CrowdTangle and Facebook and Instagram data. Some additional feature, you can, with Community, you can run simultaneously multiple data collectors at the same time. So let's say if you want to capture a data set on, let's say, COVID-19 on Reddit, but you also want to see what people are talking and saying about COVID-19 on Twitter and on Facebook, you can now run all three of those data collections simultaneously. With the Pro version, you can do 2 Reddit at the same time and 1 Twitter and 1 CrowdTangle. And the other thing is that you can also import your data sets. So if you already have an existing data set, you can format the CSV in a way that Community can ingest the data, and then you can simply upload it and use the built-in analytical features. And the other thing is that we added some collaboration-friendly features. So this way, if you have a large team and you finish analyzing your data set, you don't have to just take snapshot. You can simply share the analysis results with them. So this way they can help you with the analysis and the write-up. So that's basically a summary of the difference between EDU and Pro. You can find out more on the website. So for the rest of this presentation, we're going to get into some of the case study. But before we do, I just want to notify you that some of the posts included in the presentation that I and Anatoly will show are going to be from real users, and the content of some of the posts are offensive. So just want to give you fair warning. So one way to study online social media behavior is by using surveys. So for example, here's one from Pew Internet from 2017. According to the survey, 4 in 10 Americans reported having personally experienced online harassment. And as you can see from their result, less severe types of antisocial behaviors, such as offensive name calling, intentional effort to embarrass someone, are more common, while more severe antisocial behaviors, such as physical threats, sustained harassment, stalking, and sexual harassment, are less common, but they're there. But there's another way to examine online content interaction, and is to look for manifestation or acts of antisocial behavior. Unlike a survey, when we use social media data to study antisocial behavior, we're really studying observed behavior, not self-reported behavior or perception of the participant. So here's some example of a few different manifestation or act of antisocial behavior in online discourse that other researchers have studied in recent years. Hate speech, impoliteness, rudeness, incivility, offensive comment, stereotyping, and so on. When studying antisocial behavior in online discourse, there are a few things to keep in mind. For some online groups, what is often referred to as antisocial may be the communal norm and be practiced by the group members to socialize. So, but that's not really what we want to study. What we're interested in studying is group dynamics where such behavior may be negatively affecting the overall group cohesion and may have psychological and emotional consequences for the people who are participating. It's not something that they sign up for. There's also concern that some form of antisocial behavior, such as hate speech, for example, may galvanize xenophobic behavior offline and lead to changing social norms at the societal level. So this is some of the reason why we want to study antisocial behavior, to better understand these phenomena, because they have real world effect. Because we know that what happens online doesn't always stay online. So next, I'm going to go over a case study that we did about 1.5 years ago that uses manual content analysis of social media data to look at antisocial behavior. And so, do you have any question, thing to add at this point?
Nothing from me.
Okay, sounds good.
But again, if anybody has questions, feel free to post them to the chat room. Tiago and I we're keeping an eye on the questions as they come in.
Terrific. So this is a study we did about 1.5 years ago with Anatoly, myself, our colleague Raquel Roquero, and Felipe Soares. And we were examining toxic interaction and political engagement on Twitter in the Canadian context. The goal of this study was to better understand the online dynamic of violence on Twitter against candidates running for political office. Online violence in platforms is a pressing problem. The idea of the study was to provide research-based evidence for policymakers and governing stakeholders. We had 2 research questions for this study. What's the prevalence of toxic and insulting messages targeting political candidate? And is there a difference in frequency of toxic insulting messages directed at women versus men candidates on Twitter? So for data collection, we compile a comprehensive list of over 2,000 election candidates, people who were participating in the election. And then from that list, we look to see which one are on Twitter, because not every candidate, have a big team that can manage their social media accounts and activities for them. So some candidates were, very local candidates who have limited resources and so on. So they didn't have a Twitter account. They might have gone on to Facebook, for example. But for our study, we were looking at Twitter. So we had to identify all the candidates who had a Twitter account. So in total, we collected over 300,000 public tweets in English directed at 1,116 candidates between September 28th and October 27th, 2019. And here's a little bit of our method. So we hire and train 3 coders to hand code a random sample of about 1% of the tweet. And we told them that a message is toxic when it's rude, disrespectful, or unreasonable. And a message is insulting when it's inflammatory or negative towards a particular person or group of people. So that's basically all we told the coders, like read these 3,000 something tweets, and then identify tweets that exhibit either toxic or insulting behavior. And then only tweets flagged by all 3 coders as either toxic or insulting were considered and used in the rest of our study. Then we tested the relationship between the candidate's gender and the likelihood of them receiving a toxic or insulting tweet using a chi-square test. The result for the first question was that basically 8.4% of the messages were labeled as toxic by all 3 of the coders, and 2.8% were considered to be insulting by our coder. And there was just some examples of some of the messages. The finding from this study is in line with previous study done in this area. Southern Hammer, for example, found that 9.8% of tweets targeting British MPs were uncivil. Gorel and team showed that less than 4% of tweets directed at British MPs were abusive. And Mead found that swearing, dismissive insults, and abusive words made up around 3%. So our results basically were in line with other studies done by other scholars. For the second question, we wanted to know, is there a difference in the frequency of toxic insulting messages directed at women versus men candidates on Twitter? The results shows basically there's no significant association between gender and receiving a toxic insulting tweet. One of the reasons why we conducted this study was there was a lot of media coverage in Canada leading up to this election that women politicians were getting an excessive amount. And what we discovered is that statistically, that's not the case. But of course, there are always instances and individuals who might be a magnet for and a lightning rod for because they rise in prominent. So the result was very interesting and it's found to be contrary to what some of the common popular beliefs out there on this topic. So out of the 307 toxic and insulting tweets flagged by the majority are still publicly available, because we also ran a test to see whether Twitter was actively removing these type of toxic tweets and whether they still remain on the platform months and months afterward. And we found that the majority of them still were. So the overall percentage of toxic insulting tweets was relatively low, but also the severity, which may negatively impact one's well-being. So here's some of the implications. Irrespective of one's gender, some candidates tend to experience more extreme cases of online violence and toxicity. And social media platform needs to have a more proactive role in preventing online harassment campaigns against their user. So implication going forward, and some possible solutions. We recommend boosting referral site filtering to prevent coordinated attack from external sites. Streamline the abuse reporting process to make it more transparent and easier to track complaints. And you know what? Hire more staff to improve complaints and response time. That's something that most, if not all of the platforms are quite reluctant to do because they're all turning to AI to do that. While there's a place for AI, it can't solve everything. So here are some of the advantages and the disadvantages of manual content analysis. The advantage is that it can detect implicit instances of antisocial act and can support an analysis within a domain, media format, or language not yet well supported by automation. But there are disadvantages too. It requires 2 or more independent coders. It's difficult to get higher intercoder reliability, and it's not scalable to analyze large data set. So like for us, our sample set was small, so we were able to slog through and read all those tweets. But I can't imagine if we have to read how we would have to go through billions of tweets. So anyway, I'm gonna turn it now over to Anatoly. If you have any questions for me, please put it into the chat box or wait to the end during the Q&A. Thank you.
Hello again, everyone. I'm sharing my screen. Oh, just to confirm, can you see my screen and can you hear me? No. Okay, let me try sharing my screen one more time. How about now? Can you see slide deck? Philip, just to confirm, can you make sure you stop sharing? Maybe it's preventing me from.
Yeah, I thought I did.
Okay, excellent. So you all can see my screen now. Perfect. Maybe there was just a delay. Yeah, so let me talk about the second and third approaches to detecting what we might consider as antisocial behavior online. And as Philip said, we are specifically interested in the one that may cause some harm to individuals or groups. So I will start by looking at a more kind of dictionary-based approach, which is automated approach, but one step, I would say, below the machine learning approach. And then we will discuss machine learning-based approach and specifically how it's implemented in Communalytic using what's known as Prospective Api developed by Google. So for the demonstration of automated dictionary-based or lexicon-based, also known as lexicon-based toxicity analysis, we'll look at this second case study that we did with Priya Kumar, who was formerly a postdoctoral fellow at the lab and now with Global Affairs Canada, myself and Philip. So this is where we examine violence against women on Twitter, specifically in women of influence in India. The paper, this is based on a published paper, and I'll send you a link shortly after my presentation, so you can always look up more details. So essentially, questions we explored here were very similar what Philip presented earlier, but in different contexts. So we were interested in how is online violence against women manifested on Twitter in the Indian context. Do different Indian women of influence receive different types of online harassment on this platform? And how do posters of online harassment, abuse, and violence against women, perform those harassments, and who are they in general? Can we kind of develop a profile? Why India? Well, India is, the largest democratic democracy in the world, and there are more and more people kind of joining social media in India. But there's also, as a result, the increase in online harassment and online violence. For example, one of the recent surveys found 41% of women in India have experienced some form of online harassment. We look at case study of 101 Indian women of influence, and we look at different sectors of the society. So we look at politicians, example here, Mamata Banerjee, who was the first female chief minister of West Bengali. She's very active on Twitter. We'll look at Bollywood actresses and other celebrities. We also examine other public figures, especially journalists, news anchors. So we had a nice cross-sectional sampling of influential women in India, and including business leaders as well. And so here, because the data set was quite large, we had about 1 million of tweets directed at the accounts in our data set. It was not scalable for us to manually review 1 million of tweets. And keep in mind, we would have to have multiple quarters, multiple individuals to review them, and then measuring cross interquarter reliability would be quite hard to achieve on such a large sample. So this brought us to the automated text analysis to detect, and we decided to look for signs of explicit form of harassment towards these accounts, where individuals might be using, attackers or perpetrators might be using swear words or version of such. Certainly not all instances of using swear words on Twitter would be considered as toxic or online harassment, but in majority of cases in this context, that was the case. So we used 2 dictionaries of swear words. One was based on our early work with Hazel Kwan, which consisted of English-based swear words that we early applied to YouTube comments. But for this case, because the comments were both in English as well as in Hindi and other regional languages, our colleague Priya Kumar, who led the study, she really spent a lot of time developing the South Asian dictionary of swear words to make sure we were able to capture those as well. And so this kind of chart, tree map, kind of nicely represents our data collection, but also analysis. So we've identified a sample, as I mentioned, of 101 women of influence. And then we look for any Twitter messages for a period of 1 month that were directed at them. Because we were interested in explicit and directed attacks online. And so we hypothesized that we would find them when people are getting those messages on Twitter directed at them. And so that's how we ended up with this 900,000 tweets. So, and those were coming from 4 groups: politicians, celebrities, business leaders, and public figures. Most of the tweets were towards politicians and celebrities, not surprising here. And then, so we within each data set, we then automatically identify English-only messages or non-English messages, and we applied each dictionary that we had towards each of these subsamples. And so what the last kind of part of this chart shows you is the percentage of swearing type of tweets directed at the individuals in our data set. For example, for the group of politicians, we had about 1% of tweets directed at them in English that included some form of swearing. And same 1% of swears in South Asian dictionary. The percentage slightly higher for celebrities in English, and even higher so for business women, about 2% in English, but not as much in South Asian language. What's the largest percentage was actually towards public figures, and those include journalists, news anchors, and that was 3% in English and 2% based on South Asian dictionary. So even though the percentages are relatively small, keep in mind those are explicit and directed attacks. We certainly, by using this dictionary-based approach or lexicon-based approach, we're not able to capture implicit forms of harassment. So where maybe people not using swear words or using some kind of abbreviation that are not accounted for in our dictionaries. If you compare the results, these percentages across the literature, it does appear in line with other research that's found swearing, dismissive insults, abusive words make up about 3% of online communication in general. So that's where we are. But then I don't have too much time to go in depth. We complemented this automated dictionary-based analysis by examining content of some of these attacks based on different groups to develop kind of profiles, characteristics of different accounts that are being attacked versus different categories of perpetrators and types of assaults. So what was interesting in this data set that most attacks were not directed to a single account, because we did feel that or hypothesize at the beginning that there may be very explicit attacks on individuals. Well, in our data set, for example, when you consider politicians, most of them got attacks because they were affiliated with a particular party or supported a particular point of view. That was somewhat different for celebrities. There was a lot of body shaming in that category. So we did see that the type of insults were different depending on the category we analyzed. In terms of perpetrators, we identified kind of 3 types. News junkies, individuals who just generally active on Twitter, commenting on all kinds of news, whether it's politics or sports. So they were often hostile in generally if they didn't agree with a particular point of view. Then we had Bollywood fanatics. Those are primarily following different celebrities, and they might use some harsh language or swear words in that context. And then we have category, we call it lone wolves category. This category included a lot of trolling type of behavior. So that's, to me, was most problematic, where you have kind of persistent attacks of individual accounts on social media. And so again, the different types of, different groups receive different types of harassing messages. So celebrities and journalists receive more kind of sexualized, gendered attacks. And the CEOs and politicians were more receive attacks that kind of dismiss their professional standing or professional opinion, and so on. And this is something really only emerged when we manually evaluated a sample subset of this attacks. The swear word dictionary is not granular enough. It doesn't differentiate between different types of attacks. And so this actually brings us to more kind of machine learning approach that may help to address some of these limitations. But just to summarize advantages and disadvantages of this automated dictionary-based or lexicon-based content analysis is that, yes, it's easy to scale, but it takes a lot of time to develop and validate those dictionaries, because you have to develop dictionaries accounting for certain language, for certain platform affordances. It will be prone to some false positive results, simply because the way people use language, of course, the same words can mean different things in different contexts. And in some contexts, it may mean that it's something toxic and person is attacking somebody else. And in other contexts, it may not be the case. And if you just rely on dictionary-based approach, where you have phrases like nouns or verbs or adjectives that in this swear word dictionaries, depending on the context or surrounding words, it may change the meaning. So it doesn't capture those nuances. Before I go to the next section, this is the primary section why we're here today, to look at machine learning approach and advantages and disadvantages of this approach. and specifically examine Prospective API, how it works. So any questions about dictionary-based approach or the previous case study? I'm just going to quickly check the chat room. And if you have quick questions, feel free to use your mic as well. Okay, so I see the question. So there are two questions. One is from Alice. So the categorization was done automatically. Oh, you refer, I'm assuming you're asking for the 4 groups, Alice, is this correct? The politicians, celebrities, accounts?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, yes. So it was, yeah, we spent a lot of time. So Priya, because he is aware of the context of Indian society, and she spent a lot of time researching it as well. So she developed the sample. It was stratified sample. We found first all women politicians who were part of the parliament, upper and low chamber at the time. And so we found if they are on Twitter or not. So that was kind of very straightforward account. For other women of influence, we examined the current publications. There are lots of top 100 women of influence published. So we used those to identify. So it was very purposeful, very stratified sample. Once we identified their Twitter handles for each group, then the process was automated. We just said, we asked the Twitter collection script to say, hey, can you collect all the tweets during this month that were mentioning or replying to the individuals in question? Yeah. There was a second question from Rui. How would the dictionary specifically develop? So the dictionary, the swear words dictionaries, it's an iterative process. Essentially, we started for English dictionary, we started from the existing one. But the idea is to take a sample from our data set we want to analyze and to look for Twitter messages that include any of the words in this dictionary. And we use another platform called Netlytic for that, that we also develop in the lab. And so once we identify or Netlytic label messages that includes one of the swear words, we manually examine them to say how well this initial version of this dictionary performed. Are there any posts that not correctly identify as swear words or some words that are not used in the swear context? And we use a 10% threshold for each iteration. So if we see a particular word that we identify as a swear word, but it may be used in more than 10% as non-swear, we decided to exclude it. Just to make sure our rate of false positive results, essentially the messages that we label as toxic but might not be, would not be more than 10%. But yeah, it was very iterative, and we did have to split the 2 dictionaries into different languages because, in fact, Priya identified some words that were considered as swear words in Hindi. They were not swear words in English and vice versa. So we really have to account for that. So thank you for those questions.
Anatoly, sorry, I have another quick question. So I don't know what you did with like misspelling or Hinglish. I know sometimes they mix it up, and how do you capture those?
Yeah, so a lot of it, so there are some common misspellings for swear words, and we included those in the dictionaries already. But of course, if people use emojis or other special characters, those would be missed. And so that's, of course, the limitation of dictionary-based approach, because it's as good as as much efforts you put into developing them. Right. And it constantly has to be updated. So thank you for that, Helen. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. I love the Q&A parts. I always, when I teach, I often say, well, I like making, stopping for questions because it gives me also time to have some water. But I do want to hear questions as well. So let's continue on with machine learning, because I think this is an exciting kind of new frontier in this research. It has advantages, clear advantages, and that's why we wanted to implement access to the Prospective API as part of Communalytic. But it also, we have to keep in mind what are the disadvantages, and that's when we're talking about unintentional biases later in this presentation. But first, let me introduce you to Prospective API. And so Prospective API, now been developed and managed by Google, offers us an opportunity to automatically analyze any social media posts according to different toxicity dimensions. So this chart from the website can nicely represent the way it works. So you have a message like the one shown here, "Shut up, you an idiot!" exclamation mark. And so you send this to the system, to Prospective API, to Google Cloud, and then it analyzes it using machine learning approach, and it sends you back scores according to different metrics. The more common metrics, it's just toxicity, and the score is actually ranges from 0 to 1, and indicates, more generally speaking, likelihood, how likely that particular message that we just analyzed is, in this case, toxic. Then there's a measure called severe toxicity, and we will go through definitions for each of these measures, because we do need to understand what they're trying to, what manifestation of antisocial behavior they're trying to capture. Then under the severe toxicity, this particular measure was only scored 0.75, so maybe less severe. Was it insult? Well, the system thinks it is. It assigned 1 out of 1, from 0 to 1. Was it sexually explicit? No. And the score reflects that. It's very low, close to 0. Profanity, does it include profanity? Yeah, it includes words like idiot. So the system correctly picked that up. Likely to reject? Well, the Prospective API, I should mention, was originally developed as a way to help moderators of different forums and newspapers to moderate their comments sections. And so this likely to reject, it's a kind of aggregate feature. We're actually not supporting it in Communalytic because it's very platform specific. But the idea is essentially is how likely a moderator looking at the message will reject it because it's against their policy. Then you have metrics like threat. So those are usually trying to capture directed attack, like somebody is trying to kill someone. I do find a lot of false positive results for this category. So I usually personally don't rely on that. We'll talk about that later. But in this case, the system doesn't think it's a threat to an individual. And finally, there's a category called identity attack. And so identity attack is when somebody posting insulting messages or toxic messages directed at specific group in our society. Like a minority group. And so in this case, the system didn't see that it's identity attack, and that's why it scored very low. So that's how it works. And so the idea is we want to integrate, we want to be able to apply this analysis to any data set that you've collected via Communalytic, which can come from Reddit. Today, I'll show you examples from Reddit, but later in this in the bootcamp, we will also look at how do we interpret the scores for Twitter data sets, for example. And in fact, we'll have a guest speaker in 2 weeks. We will announce a little bit later, who did use Communalytic and Prospective API to analyze sentiments around wearing masks to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So a very interesting case study based on Twitter, but that's coming in 2 weeks. Just a preview. All right. So how Google came up with this algorithm? Well, when we're talking about machine learning approach, we always have to think about what was the training data set, what was the data set that was used to train this machine learning approach. In their case, they started it with more publicly available comments data set from Wikipedia. So Wikipedia has what most of us know as Wikipedia pages, more information about different people or entities. But behind each page, there's the sections where editors, wiki editors, trying to kind of debate and discuss what to include, what to exclude. And so there are lots of, or sometimes conversation can be very hostile. And so there are publicly available data sets that people from Prospective API used to train their machines. The New York Times comment section was also used as for training purposes. And the idea was very similar to what Philip presented actually in case number 1, where this group asked many human quarters, more than 3 per message. I believe in some cases they had 5 or even more quarters, to identify whether a comment was toxic or not, whether a particular comment was insulting or not. But by having many quarters, you can get an average agreement overall around each post. And that's how the machine learning was trained. And there are multiple techniques. It's really outside of the scope of this bootcamp to talk about different machine learning approaches. But here, as reported, they use the latest or known, the approach that's known to perform very well, convolution neural networks, CNN, not to be confused with the news station. Anyway, so this is if you relying on Prospective API to publish your papers, this is kind of methodology related information that you can include. Now let's quickly go through each of the 6 primary measures provided by Prospective to see how it's defined, to look at each example. And so let's start with more broad one, toxicity, and broadly defined as message rude, disrespectful, or or generally unreasonable. And it doesn't have to attack an individual or a group. Example, this is one of the stupidest things I've read, but F me, I laughed at the second line. So it's toxic. It's maybe not in a harassment type of post, but it does use a lot of swear words. But then there's a category called severe toxicity. So it's a version of toxicity, but kind of on with a bit higher threshold. So it consider very hateful, aggressive, disrespectful posts. And the scores are less sensitive to posts that included positive uses of curse words. So F off, pathetic loser. No one cares about your worthless opinion. So this is, you can see the message is really much more kind of toxic, essentially. Insult, so insulting, inflammatory, or negative posts towards an individual or a group. So insult, there are few of them, and we saw that in our case study when our human quarters look at the posts towards politicians, where we saw the number of insulting messages much fewer, which you want to see if you're looking for healthy online conversations. But it's also important to capture those. Example of insulting post could be how F stupid is and the name of the person. So it's not, this one is not directly insulting an individual, but because they mention it, it is kind of directed towards a particular person. And I will continue reading this. That is pretty F stupid. What's next? A deep fake? Having him say racist things as a social experiment? Question mark. So you can see it has different kind of properties than general toxic or severe toxicity type of posts. And the main differentiator is that it has a personal name, organizational name, or identity group mentioned in the post. Now, there is also subcategory of posts that are called identity attacks. And so those are negative posts attacking someone because of their identity. It could be race, gender, sexual orientation, ideology, religion, nationality, and other identities. Example could be here. You people are a bunch of Fs, and I voted for and the name of the party. So I see also Anton asking, is inflammatory language is a requirement for toxicity? It depends. In our work, we do see there's an overlap between toxicity score and insults. And I'll show you correlation results. We correlated, measured correlation between all these measures. So you'll see there's a high correlation, but insults are much more a smaller category. In many cases, I would say it's a subcategory of toxicity, but there are some nuances when it's not as toxic or determined not as toxic by the system. But most of the time, if someone insulted, it's also toxic. Yeah. Profanity. And so the profanity, this is most closely related to the dictionary approach that I showed you in the case study 2 about the Indian women of influence, where we had our predefined swear word dictionaries. This is very similar. It will capture any posts that include swear words or some kind of obscene language. An example could be, why vote for the name of the party when you know they won't win an S word? All right, and finally the threats. So posts with an intention to inflict pain, injury, or violence against an individual or group. I haven't seen many of these, and hopefully you won't see many of those in the data sets. If you do, it's very problematic for groups and of course individuals who might be on the receiving end. So example could be, shoot all yellow vests, we have to kill all Nazis. And so what I noticed, Prospective API picks up, ranks messages that includes words like shoot or kill high on this scale. And I do find sometimes more false positive results for this category, simply because it's they're very small examples. This dimension was trained on, I'm assuming, and because the use of words like shoot me, I love it, can be used in a positive way too in slang. Sometimes it creates those miscategorizations. So this actually brings us to how do we evaluate, or how did Prospective API evaluated their models? Can we rely on machine learning? Some of you might have heard criticism of this machine learning approach to identify toxic messages. So let's dive deeper and see how it was evaluated and what kind of things we have to keep in mind. And so what I want to say that the Prospective API right now published their formal evaluation based on their most generic metric, the toxicity score. And so for your publications, I think if you're doing it at scale, without any interventions or any sampling and manual cross-validation of your results, I think it's safe to rely on toxicity score, that the most general definition of toxicity. And you can always cite the provided evaluation metrics. For other scores, they're not formally published, at least not on their website yet. You still can rely on Prospective API to identify or label flag messages that might be insulting or include identity attacks. But I do suggest to kind of manually cross-validate the results, at least based on a sample of your results. All right, so let's look at toxicity score and how it was evaluated. And so to evaluate results of a particular algorithm, machine learning algorithm, in this case, we call it classification model because it classifies messages as toxic or not. We want to look at the true positive rate and false positive rate. So let's just briefly define true positive rate. Some of you who are familiar with machine learning will also know this metric by recall. It's called recall. But true positive essentially calculates the percentage of messages, toxic messages, that were able to be identified by the system. So if there are 100 toxic messages in the data set, and your algorithm only identified 80 out of 100, then the true positive rate will be 0.8, so 80%. So we would be somewhere here. So that's the true positive. So it's clearly you want to increase true positive rate. You want to get all 100% of toxic messages identified. On the other hand, if you look at the false positive rate, it's also an important metric. It essentially looks at the percentage of messages that are not toxic, but they were labeled as such. So they were misclassified. They falsely were said these are toxic messages. Well, they're not. And so the task of machine learning or evaluating machine learning approach is to maximize, to see how well the algorithm maximizes the rate of true positives while minimizing false positive results. Well, the challenge is represented here using this, what we call ROC curve, or receiver operating characteristics curve. And so you can see here for the toxicity score for Prospective API, as you increase the true positive rate, you also at some point starting to noticeably increase the false positive results. So for example, if we were looking for everything that includes F word, as we include in more messages with F word, we might be also including messages where F word was used in socializing in a non-toxic way, for example. And so it shows you that it's really hard to get 100% true positive rate without including at least some percentage of false positive results. And so essentially you have to kind of choose your threshold. And to decide, sometimes it depends on your research questions. Sometimes it depends on the data set. So if position 1, for example, will allow you to identify true positive rate about 40%, you can identify 40%, and in that 40% of your the results, there will be very few, like close to 0 false positive results. So you will know that the 40% you identify, maybe it's not all toxic messages, but the ones you identify, there will be fewer false positive results. And maybe that's all you need. And that, for example, settings may be good for identifying spam in your emails. So spam in your emails, you don't want to label your emails from your colleagues as spam. So you don't want to increase false positive results too much. But you do want to capture the ones you label as spam by your email client. You want to make sure that it is actually spammy. On the other hand, I think for when we're looking at toxicity analysis, in our case, we're looking at position somewhere near 2, where we at the verge of this curve line turning and increasing the toxicity score. Increasing false positive results, but while maximizing our true positive return. Because at some point, even if we get all near 100% of true positive, then the false positive will be too high, 40%. And then the results also not accurate. So it's a balancing act. And what a machine learning field suggested, instead of looking at this curve line and looking at different positions, like the way we look at it, we can summarize the performance of a machine learning algorithm by looking at, by measuring this space under the curve. It's called area under the curve. And so if you actually calculate this area and you come up with this number, you don't need to do it manually. Most of the programs can do it automatically. So you can get a number between 0 and 1, and it's called AUC, area under the curve. And so this value suggests that the model will perform poorly if the score is close to 0. But it will predict 100% correctly if the score is 1. But we know that it's nearly impossible to get AUC score of 1. Based on the literature, how do you evaluate, what's the good value of AUC? And we will see this metric in a couple instances later. And so we need to know what's considered to be a good AUC. So the score is 0.9, outstanding. So for toxicity score, as shown here, Prospective API gets the AUC score of 0.096. So it's in the outstanding range. 0.8 to 0.9 is excellent, and 0.7 to 0.8 is acceptable. So, which means that anything that you see below 0.7, you cannot really trust the machine learning approach that produce AUC less than 0.7. So I would not even use it for publication. Any quick question about these two concepts, the AUC or ROC curve in general? Just want to make sure this part is clear, because we're going to use these numbers to evaluate unintended biases in Prospective API. So I hear no questions. So why don't we continue on? And I'm also keeping an eye on time. It's almost 11 o'clock here in Toronto. And we said the session will be 1 hour and 30 minutes. So let me take the next maybe 10, 15 minutes to show you the rest of the evaluation. And then we will stop recording and we'll open up for your additional questions. So when we evaluate the machine learning model, we can certainly look at this more generic AUC approach for the whole data set, for the whole results. But when we're talking about toxicity, we also need to account for unintended biases in machine learning models. Essentially, these are examples when some words in some cultures may be used either in positive or negative context. And so if the word is used in a negative context, and machine learning is trained on those negative examples of that word, then it may start associating that word with only or mostly negative examples. So the word gay is a good example because in slang with some cultures, somebody may say, oh, it's so gay, meaning that it's bad. So if somebody trained the machine learning on examples like that, and the machine learning will say, oh, every time there's a message includes the word gay, well, it's probably negative, it's toxic message. But look at this example. The Gay and Lesbian Film Festival starts today. It's just an announcement. But if you naively train the machine learning algorithm without considering those unintended biases, the toxicity score may be quite high for this message when it's not. There are other examples for other words, like being transgender is independent of sexual orientation. Well, there's nothing negative about this statement, but it's just informative statement. But the toxicity score is, halfway through, so it's higher than it should be. And same with the third example. A Muslim is someone who follows a practice or practices Islam. And again, it's not clear why the toxicity score is as high as 0.4 here, because this is just a general statement, but it's because a machine learning algorithm might have been trained on examples where words like Muslim or Islam might have been used in a negative context, or as if somebody were attacking people because of their identity or religion. And so Prospective API, the first version, was somewhat criticized for not accounting for these unintended biases. And so since then, now they released version 6, and that's what we're using right now. They improve their both evaluation and the performance of their toxicity analysis on this to account for unintended biases. To do that, what they did, they subdivided their training evaluation datasets into 3 groups. One is they call it subgroup AUC, where they included only examples that mention the specific identity subgroups. And so we already talked about AUC values. So AUC value generally summarizes how well a machine learning model works. And so a low value in this metrics for this group will indicate that model does a poor job of distinguishing between toxic and non-toxic comments that mention the identity group. The second group sample they divided it is they included non-toxic examples that mention the identity and toxic examples that don't mention the identity. So they're trying to play this trick with the machine learning approach to see how well it can differentiate the two. And so for this group, a low value of this matrix will likely suggest that the model predicts higher toxicity scores than it should for non-toxic examples mentioning the identity, like that Gay and Lesbian Film Festival. So if the model assigns a toxicity score for that statement high, very high, then it means it did poorly for this second test. The third group included toxic examples that mention the identity, but non-toxic examples that don't mention the identity. And so if the AUC values are low for this group, then it means that the model, the classification model, likely predicts lower toxicity scores than it should for toxic examples mentioning the identity. So it's kind of reverse of the second test. And so you'll see this a bit more clearly in this next example. So this is what Prospective API calls a report card. So report cards. So they identify certain keywords here that belongs to different identity groups based on religion, race, ethnicity, sexual orientations, and so on. And so this is just a screenshot, and the link is on the slide, and we will share all the slides by next week on the Bootcamp website, so you can have all the clickable links to explore further. but essentially the words like lesbian, gay, queer, straight, and so on relate to different identities. And these are single words and relates, assuming that it relates to person belongs to one single identity. That's why this test called unitary identity. Later on, we will do a cross-sectional identity test. So the numbers you see here, these AUC numbers, the ones that we've talked about. And so each column is different test, different subgroups. And what you can see on the left side, the scorecard for version 1 that Prospective released in 2017, and then version 6 released a year and a half later. And so the densely colored cells highlight some of the low performance scores. So remember, we talked about the AUC values thresholds. Anything below 0.7 is not acceptable for machine learning. And you can see here clearly that in version 1, any posts that included word like homosexual would the model will perform poorly. The AUC for certain tests will be 0.5, which is not acceptable. And this indicates that model would likely predict higher toxic scores than it should for non-toxic examples of that group. And so by properly training the model to look for those keywords, the latest model produced AUC for the same test 0.96, which is in the outstanding category. So that's how you read the scorecards. And it's quite hard, as I mentioned, to reach 1, the value of 1 on AUC. So anything above 0.9 should be considered as great, as acceptable. Now, because people can belong to multiple identity groups, they also produce report cards for intersectional identities, where there are 2 keywords that indicate 2 different identities. So for example, we'll look at the first example, black, gay. So the person is black and also gay. So it's that's why it's test intersectionality. And so you can see a lot of darker colors in the version 1 under the second category, second test. And again, this is test where examples, these keywords like black, gay would be assigned, any messages with these keywords will be treated more toxic or will be assigned as having higher toxicity score when they should not be by the system in the version 1. And in the latest version, it's not 0.9 and above for the black gay keywords. It's but it's pretty close. It's 0.89. So it tells you it's not foolproof, but it's in the what literature suggests excellent category for AUC values. So it's much improved. But this gives you an idea why machine learning, the use of machine learning to identify toxicity, and in general, in Prospective API in particular, has been criticized for misclassifying certain things. But you can see the improvements here. And certainly for your publications, you always I always recommend to get a sample of your messages to cross-validate some of these results as well. So now to show you quickly, and we have a tutorial, if Tiago, you can post a link. We do have a tutorial how to use toxicity analysis in Communalytic on the website, as well as how to access Prospective API on the website. So that's why I'm going to go very quickly for this part. And this is the last part for today. You can access Prospective API either using some kind of programming language like Python script, or in our case, you can use a web interface. That's the whole point for developing Communalytics, so that non-programmers can actually use easily interact with APIs like Prospective API through the web interface. And so that's what I will focus on. I will use example from Reddit, and I will use data set we've been studying from a group called Meta Canada, a forum largely, but not exclusively populated by conservatives. And in fact, since last year, it moved away from Reddit because some of the members of this group felt they were overly moderated. So we collected data around the Canadian federal election in 2019. So it's similar time frame that case study 1 that Philip presented on, but the data is coming from Reddit. And there were about 20,000 messages posted to this group over this period of time, right before and after federal election here in Canada. And once we collected the data, and that's we discussed last time we met, we now want to analyze all the messages we've collected to assign those toxicity scores using Prospective API. Well, first we need to add the Prospective API key, because each of you will get your own Prospective API key. Once you have it, you will go to under my profile section of the website and enter it to your account. So nobody else using the system will have access to your key. And the reason it's important to get your own keys because Google limits how many calls, how many messages you can analyze every minute. And the rate is a bit low. They only allow us to analyze 10 messages per minute for each key. So as a result, so it's not Communalytics specific. This is really Google API specific. So as a result, it really makes sense to run this analysis on the background. So Communalytics would be useful in that way. You can start the analysis and then come back to it in a day, depending on the size of your data set. But before you can enter your key, you need to get this key. So so if you go to Prospective API website, they outline the steps you need to request it. You need to have your Google account, and because you sign into Communalytics, I'm assuming you have your Gmail ready to sign in. Keep in mind, if your institution has Gmail-based account, it doesn't work very well with Google Cloud. For example, here at Ryerson University, our emails are also based on Gmails, and I generally can sign into Gmails or other services. I can use my account to sign into Communalytics, but I cannot use my Ryerson Gmail with Google Cloud Console. So keep that in mind if you get an error when creating a project in Google Cloud Console. You might have to create a separate Gmail outside of your institution. So once you're in this Google Cloud Console, it will look something like this. And to use any APIs that Google provides, you have to create a project, what they call it. And this is also outlined in the steps that Tiago shared with you in the chat room. So you create this project just so that Google can give you permission to this project to request to run the Prospective API. When you're creating a project using this interface, you want to write down the project ID. I highlighted it here. So the project name you assign, but the project ID is automatically assigned by Google. And this is something you need when you applying to get access to Prospective API. So just make sure you copy and paste the project ID because you'll need it for this form. So this is a simple Google form where you just specify your name, affiliation, and that project ID. Google team promise to respond to you within a day or two max, and they're generally fast to approving your requests. And so once they approve it, you get the message that it's approved. You can go back to your Cloud Console link. And so now you can actually go to within this Cloud Console, within your project. You can see, for example, in my case, I'm under my project 33805. It's whatever name you entered it. But what I want to do, I want to go to API libraries section or library on the left side menu so that I can locate the specific Prospective API and enable it. Because by default, even though you approve to get access to the API, it will disabled by default. So once you can search for word Prospective within this API library because there are many APIs. So you can browse it, or I find it easier just to search for Prospective. And so you'll see this Prospective Comment Analyzer API. So you clicked on it, Prospective Comment Analyzer API, and then you have to say enable it. So that's an important step. And I also noticed once you enable it, it may take 1 hour or two for your permissions to kick in, because sometimes if you try to use a Prospective API right away in Communalytics, it may give you an error. It will say, oh, toxicity analysis is stuck. It's stuck. But it's because there's a delay when after they approve it, maybe the system needs some time to recognize your credentials. But you're not done yet. So we're still within this Google Cloud Console, where we found the API, Prospective API, we enable it, but now we need to generate credentials for Communalytic or other scripts, if you want to use outside Communalytic, to access this API on your behalf. So this is where you go to Credentials menu in your Google Cloud Credentials. And under the Credentials, you just hit Create New Credentials. So there's a plus sign here, Create Credentials. And you will select API keys, API key. That's a single key. It's a combination of different characters. And it's simple as that. So it generates this long series of numbers, characters. You copy the key. And then this is what you want to enter under the profile, enter the key. So now every time you request to run to toxicity analysis, it will use your key to make sure that you have access to it. So there are multiple steps to get the key and then enter the key. And I know at first it may be a bit overwhelming, but the good thing that you only need to do it once. Once you get it approved, once you get the key, you can use it for all of your data sets. You don't have to re-enter it, anything. And also we're here. So if you have any challenges with the steps, we want to support your work. So just email us info@socialmedialab.ca, and one of us will certainly help you with that. Once we have the key entered, and now we want to analyze this Meta Canada, in my case, data set, you go to my data set page, you will see something like this. There is a lightning sign for toxicity analysis. We had an interesting discussion with Philip, like what would be the symbol to represent toxicity analysis so that it's kind of intuitive for this interface to have. So Philip suggested lightning sign. So you can blame or thank him for that. But this is it. So you click on that lightning sign. Alternatively, if you want to access, if you already view in your data set with this zoom box, if you're in this overview page, on the left side, you also have a button called toxicity analysis. That's another way to access the toxicity analysis page. Once you're on that page, there are a couple of points I want to make. There are lots of documentations. And again, the tool is designed for researchers, by researchers. So we often include a lot of information so you can have it for your publications. Because I think for this type of work, you have to be very transparent how the data was collected, how it was analyzed. It's somewhat different from more, commercially marketing-oriented products for social media analytics where you don't have any of this. So that was, I just want to say that's a design choice to include the text. And so what this text tells you is that, well, you can run toxicity analysis in multiple languages. I believe it's now 7 languages. And I think, Tiago, if you can post those languages into the chat room would be great. So English, Italian, French. They recently, Prospective API recently added support for Arabic. We about a couple of weeks behind when Prospective API adds a new language to support. Because they have to train the algorithms on new language. So we're planning to add Arabic language for Arabic in June, but otherwise there are 7 languages already implemented. So you kind of have to determine, so Communalytic will try to automatically identify based on first 100 messages or so in your data set, what language it's in, what's the majority language. And if it's English, that's what the drop-down menu will show, but you can always override it. So if you know that your data set coming from, let's say, Russian-speaking subreddit or Italian-speaking subreddit, you need to change that. Otherwise, your scores will not be accurate. The other point to make is, so Prospective API has a limit as to how many characters they can analyze per call. So right now, posts longer than 300 characters will be automatically truncated. So most of the, social media conversations will fit under that category. Tweets 280 characters. Reddit posts are rarely that long. That would be an essay. And frankly, the longer message it is, I find it as toxicity scores perhaps would be less accurate because there are many themes emerged in that conversations. But keep that in mind. So it's any messages that longer than that, it will be truncated, and only first 300,000 characters will be analyzed through Prospective API. We also remove URLs just to make sure in text, just to make sure they don't bias the results. If you analyze in tweets, and we'll talk about it, we don't remove hashtags right now, but keep in mind, because some hashtags will have negative words or keywords part of them, and that can also change the toxicity scores. And so once you finish, once you analyze, start analysis, you'll see this progress bar. And this is what I'm talking about when I said Prospective API only allows us to run 10 messages per minute. So it's somewhat long process, and we estimate how long it will take. You don't have to stare at the progress bar. Sometimes I do enjoy it, and I click check progress button to see the progress. But if it's a large data set, it's best to just wait and come back next day to see where you're at.
Hi, Anatoly.
Yes, Philip,
just
jump
want to
in.
quickly
Yes.
mention the Prospective API. That's the standard they give to everybody when you first apply. But there is also a process for you to get an upgrade. So if you find that the process is taking too slow because your data set is too big, you can always go back to Prospective API and request an upgrade. And usually they will grant that. So this way your rate limit is going to be a lot higher.
Yeah,
but like
well,
I said,
thank
for most
you.
people, it will be enough.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning, Philip. And so right now in Communalytic, though, there's no way to flag what rate you use if you have an increase allocation. So if you do have that allowance increased to, usually they increase it to 100 messages per minute. So for example, for our research account, we did requested that a special increase, and it was a straightforward process. Just describing what research project you're doing, and it was 100 messages per minute. So if you do want to use, if you did receive that increase and you want to use it in Communalytic, please email us at info@Social Media Lab so that we can manually enable it for your specific account. Because right now the system by default will assume that you have default 10 messages per minute rate. Once you finish, regardless of your rate limit, you will see this table in Communalytics that summarizes common metrics. And keep in mind, for some non-English datasets that Prospective supports, some of these categories will not be available. And just has to do with the available training datasets. For example, sexually explicit and flirting, or I think threats is there, but flirting will not be part of non-English datasets. Just keep in mind that this list may change, but you always will see the toxicity, severe toxicity, and identity attack and insults for any languages supported by Prospective. We show an average, but average toxicity score for the whole data set, sometimes misleading. We also show highest value and low values. Usually you'll have some highest values close to 1 and lowest values close to 0. What you can do here is to click on each of this score, and it will bring you to the new page, which shows you like top most toxic messages based on a particular measure, just to validate, to make sure that toxicity analysis identify or use the language properly. And in this case, I see a lot of F messages, so it looks like it picked up the toxic interactions pretty well for this data set. The other thing is to look at is the distribution of scores from 0 to 1. Remember, each score listed here is a range from 0 to 1. So close to 1 is more likely to be toxic or insulting, depending on the measure. So we provide these distributions for each score for your data set to give you an idea, what is the relative ratio of non-toxic, which is something below 0.5 for sure, versus close to 1 scores. Most of the distribution charts will look left-leaning, so they will be skewed towards left because most of the messages you'll find are not non-toxic, which is expected. But if you look at, so this is an example of this distribution charts I'm talking about. And essentially, you can see most of the messages here are non-toxic, but then there is a spike here close to 1. So this is the group you are interested in exploring. There's a small percentage of messages that were scored close to 1. So those are toxic interactions. But then if you applying a stricter threshold, a severe toxicity, this bump at the end is not as pronounced. But then if you're just looking at profanity, like swear words, the bump, this spike in numbers messages with swear words is actually higher than just regular toxicity. So you can see each metrics perform slightly differently. And the idea is to explore those spikes close to the one area. But where's the threshold, you ask me? Like, what is considered to be toxic? So if we're talking about toxicity score, is 0.5 a toxic message? Is 0.6 toxic message? Well, Prospective API purposely doesn't give you a threshold because threshold will change number of false positive results. The low threshold is more likely if you will find all or most toxic messages, but it's also more likely that you will include false positive results. So you really have to consider your research questions, your data sets to determine the thresholds. In our experiments, so just to give you an idea for this Meta Canada Reddit group, which was somewhat toxic, I would say. So in this table, we present results, percentage of toxic, severe toxic messages, and so on, based on threshold of 0.7, 0.8, and 0.9. So if we count number of messages that received a toxicity score 0.7 or above, there were 15% of them in the data set of 20,000 as toxic. This is a relatively high number because remember, for other groups we presented in case studies, we only had around 3, maybe 8% maximum. 15% is quite high. But look what happened if we move the threshold. If we say what we consider to be toxic is a message that received a 0.8 score or above, then the percentage of these messages is smaller, 10%. And even so, if we go with 0.9 threshold, only 5% will be considered as toxic. And you can see similar effect happens for other metrics, like severe toxicity with threshold 0.7 and above, it's 6% of messages classified as such, and only 2% with threshold 0.8. So there is no right or wrong answer. You really have to account for, is it an exploratory study? Are you trying to capture as many instances of toxic interactions? Then perhaps setting threshold 0.7 is appropriate, while realizing that there may be some false positive results. Alternatively, if you have space in the paper, perhaps reporting on multiple thresholds also makes sense. But on the other hand, if you really want to be more sure to reduce false positive results, setting a harsh, very high threshold of 0.9 will only find more kind of explicit forms of toxicity, but at least you will be sure that there will be or should be fewer false positive results. So I think those decisions needs to be discussed in the context of your domain data set and so on. And again, each threshold will determine where you're at on this curve. Remember, we talked about this curve. So depending on the threshold, you will be either capturing a lot of false positives, but also capturing, true positives, but also capturing false positives like here, or maybe you will be capturing fewer false positives if you set threshold, let's say 0.9, but then all of them will be true positives, so most of them. Now the question about correlation. So I remember a couple of you asked me, what's the difference between insults and toxicity? What's the overlap? We also wondered about that these questions as well. And so we ran for the Meta Canada data set. We did just simple correlation. You can do it in any software, SPSS, R, Excel. And so you just compare the toxicity scores. And so you can find that severe toxicity and toxicity, not surprisingly, highly correlated. So there are certainly fewer messages that would be classified under severe toxicity, but among them, of course, all of them will be toxic. So that's why the correlation is quite high. With insult, you see very similar pattern, and correlation, even you can see slightly higher than severe toxicity with toxicity. Same with profanity. So if you consider like what measures should you use for your research, is it toxicity, is it severe insults, or profanity? All 4 measures based on our data sets are highly correlated, correlation 0.9 and above. So in a way, it's really up to your research question. Are you only interested in examining direct attacks, insults, then the insulting category makes sense for you. Or are you trying to cast a wider net? So then perhaps profanity or toxicity scores will be more appropriate. And again, keep in mind that the evaluations that I showed you for unintended biases right now, from what I can tell, only available for the only toxicity score, the more generic one. So from the publication perspective, it certainly will be easier to explain or provide evaluation for that measure than some other ones. Identity attack and threats are more different measures, are most different, I would say, than the 4 other ones. So if you're in research design, you're looking at toxicity and then looking additionally at identity attack and threat, that makes sense because 3 measures are quite different conceptually, as well as it clearly shows assign different scores to different measures. Now, what else you can do? You can do a lot of things with scores, but first you will need to export them. So in Communalytic, there are limited features to explore these scores. We do integrate these toxicity scores as part of the network analysis and network visualizations. Some of them we will be covering in July. So I think that's an exciting new direction. You know, we merge in this toxicity analysis with network analysis. It's a very new, interesting opportunity to look at the data sets. We'll examine that in July. But otherwise, I do suggest you to export your data set as you would normally do from Communalytic. And you'll see this CSV file, which can open Excel or Google Spreadsheets. And if you export the same data set after you ran toxicity analysis in Communalytic, you will find additional columns in your data set. So the columns will include scores for each message. And this is where you can slice and dice it. You can run your correlations or other type of analysis you want for any measures in relation to any data sets.